An Arkansas mother is behind bars, accused of giving her children marijuana and vape pens. The kids' ages range from just 6 years old to 15. She reportedly told detectives that her goal was to deter them from smoking. But now, the only thing they're staying away from is her. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kennedi Walker, and I'll walk you through the details. You're watching Law and Crime. An Arkansas mother will spend 120 days behind bars after allegedly admitting to giving marijuana to her own children. 36-year-old Deanna Woods was first arrested back in January. According to investigators, she gave marijuana and THC edibles to 3 of her 4 kids, ages 6, 10, and 15. Law&Crime obtained court documents showing a Department of Human Services worker interviewed one of Woods' children, who revealed her mom had allegedly been allowing them to consume illegal substances. According to police, a drug test confirmed the child had THC in their system. Woods was taken into custody the next day. Per the affidavit, she confessed to giving her children THC-infused honey and chocolate and letting her 6 and 10-year-old use her vape pen. She also allegedly admitted to smoking marijuana around her 1-year-old and said she used the drug while breastfeeding. While Woods does have a valid medical marijuana card, she reportedly told investigators she had exposed her children to marijuana more than a dozen times over the past year, reportedly to deter them from using it themselves. But experts warn that exposure to cannabis at such a young age carries serious risks. A University of Toronto study found that teens who use cannabis are 11 times more likely to develop a psychotic disorder than those who don't. And when researchers looked specifically at emergency room visits and hospitalizations, the risk jumped to 27 times higher. The same study found no such link in adults ages 20 to 33. Following her arrest, Woods was charged with 12 counts each of endangering the welfare of a minor and introduction of a controlled substance into the body of another person. A judge sentenced her to 120 days in jail after she agreed to enter a guilty plea to 1 count of each charge. She's also been ordered to have no contact with her children unless approved by their guardian and the Department of Human Services. And here to break down the story with me is Bethany Pridgeon, a forensic chemist. Bethany, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So let's start from the beginning. Just from a chemistry standpoint, how potent can THC edibles be? And are there risks with how the body processes them, especially for children?
Well, most of the cannabis products on the market with THC, and when we're talking about THC, we're talking about Delta 9 THC, which is the active impairing compound in marijuana. So it's, most all the products are made for adults. So the dosages are going to be made for the adult body. So first of all, that's definitely going to cause an issue when you're giving it to a smaller body, a small child. It's going to be a higher dose than they could even tolerate. So that of course is an issue. And then also with vaping and edibles, the percent of THC in a lot of the products on the market is much higher than what you would necessarily see in a marijuana cigarette. So again, you've got really high dosages there. And then you've also got labeling issues where maybe you think you're giving a certain dosage, but there's so many products on the market right now that sometimes they're actually not labeled properly. And so we don't actually know the amount that's there. That can really have a lot of long-term and short-term impacts on not just an adult, but especially on someone who's younger and smaller.
Yeah, and her 6-year-old reportedly tested positive for THC. What kind of test would be used to detect that in a child? Would it be urine, hair, blood?
All of the above can be used. I've seen a lot of times they'll use hair for children just because it's a little bit less intrusive. I don't know exactly what they used here, but urine, blood, hair are all going to be especially useful to determine if there was some there and then how much.
And speaking of just like the accuracy, because a lot of people may be like, oh, that test, how do we know, how legitimate it was? But those, especially the hair test, I know you can tell if something's been in your system for a while, correct? And can THC stay in a child's system longer than it would in an adult?
I don't know that I would say it would stay longer, but the interesting thing about THC is, unlike a lot of other drugs, it's a fat loving compound. So THC will stay in the body longer because it goes into the tissues and the fat content of the body and then can slowly seep out. You would absolutely see it in hair. Hair can be tested to see drugs, especially when they've been used frequently, up to 90 days after last use. So that's why a lot of times hair samples are used in cases, especially with kids. There are tests that aren't as accurate, like maybe screening tests that would just look for cannabinoids in general. Based on the information that I read, it sounds like there was some type of confirmatory testing, which would be like additional testing to specify that they actually found delta 9 THC, which again is the harmful, impairing substance that would be in the body.
This is a Law&Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. The suspect reportedly admitted to giving her children THC 12 times over a year. Can forensic testing show if that's true or if it happened more recently?
So cannabinoids can stay in the body longer than a lot of other drugs. We wouldn't necessarily be able to see, like, is it true that it happened 12 times over a year process? But again, hair tests are going to be able to indicate, exposure within the last 90 days. And then, there are some metabolites of THC that can stay present in the system, in the blood, and in the urine for weeks or even months. So you would at least be able to see that there, has been prior exposure and use. And again, hair testing would give you a wider long-term window of was there exposure for a longer period of time.
And that's the THC, but what about vaping? Because she also allegedly allowed her 6 and her 10-year-olds to use her vape pen. From a forensic chemist perspective, what are you looking for when someone vapes THC versus ingests it?
Well, it's the same chemical compound. So you're going to see the same delta 9 THC is that molecule, whether it's in the vape pen or whether it's in an edible. Now, what you might see are higher concentrations if vape pens are used, because the vape pens tend to have a much higher percent of THC in them than an edible would have.
Would secondhand exposure, like her smoking near the kids, be enough for them to test positive as well? Because sometimes, we don't really hear about these instances of parents giving their children, edibles a lot, but we do hear about the secondhand exposure. So how does that affect kids?
So yeah, so there are definitely studies that show that secondhand exposure can cause children to test positive. Again, these are smaller people; they're breathing it in. People smoke it in, so they are going to have some exposure. Anytime you smoke anything, the other people around you are going to be exposed. I wouldn't expect the levels, and we didn't really get any quantitative numbers here, but I wouldn't expect the levels to be as high in secondhand exposure as I would to direct exposure or ingestion.
Right, of course. And what
Right.
about breastfeeding? She also admitted to allegedly to smoking while breastfeeding her 1-year-old. Can THC pass through breast milk? If so, how much does that affect an infant?
Yeah, so again, because THC is a fat-loving compound, it likes breast milk. It's going to want to seep into it. So not only is there water there, but we have a lot of fat content in breast milk because that's how infants get their primary nutrition and their primary calories. So unfortunately, THC will go into breast milk, and because it likes to absorb into fat and tissues, it can actually stay in the system for a long period of time after last use of marijuana. So, there is a high risk of exposure to the infant, and effects that could be long lasting on the infant because of the exposure from the breast milk.
Can we just dive into those long lasting effects?
Yeah, so everyone, all humans have an endocannabinoid system. It's why our bodies react the way that they do to cannabinoids and cannabis, things like THC and CBD. In the developing brain, what the endocannabinoid system helps contribute to people developing how they will manage their memory, their impulse control. It helps them with how their mind and their body copes with anxiety. And so, if you're exposing that system to a drug or to a compound that can alter that development, it can lead to long term issues with judgment, impulse control, potentially having anxiety. Early exposure to marijuana and THC can lead to cannabis use disorder. Because there's been a long-term use. And so the younger you start, the more likely that disorder could occur earlier in life. So there's a lot of concerns with just up to age 25, your brain is developing, and so altering the function and the development that deals with these very important mental health and physical issues is kind of scary. Is high risk.
And it's important that you bring that up because, according to reports, the mother claimed that she was trying to deter the kids from using marijuana. And that's why she allegedly gave the kids her vape and gave them those THC edibles. When you hear something like that, that exposing them to this would deter them, what do you think? Because with what you just said, it seems like that would never happen. If anything, it would make it worse for the kids to be exposed so early.
Yeah, I mean, I try to, I was trying to think about this, situation. I know there's a lot of information about the medical positive uses of cannabis. But again, a lot of that is limited to studies with adults, right? And I think in this day and age, it's, hard to imagine that there was some type of information out there saying that this type of exposure would help prevent use later. I mean, what we do know, from common knowledge at this point and scientific studies is that early exposure most likely leads to early use and risk earlier in life of marijuana use and potentially other drug use.
Could smaller amounts of THC still be harmful, especially to children?
I mean, I think any amounts are harmful to the developing brain. There are no doubt medical benefits to cannabis in certain situations and for some people. And again, for adults, we've seen that, and for children with certain disorders. But the use of cannabis or any drug should be really monitored by medical professionals. And certainly, there hasn't been any advice given to give any type of drugs to help prevent drug use later in children.
Absolutely. I know we spoke, about the secondhand and also just inhaling it. So when it is those secondhand instances, though, is there any forensic method to determine whether the exposure was accidental versus intentional?
The test alone would not be able to tell you how the exposure occurred. It would just tell you if there was exposure and there was enough to detect it in the system. So typically in forensics, if are trying to pinpoint how, I mean, there's going to have to be other information surrounding the use. But the test alone are only going to say, yes, there was exposure and it's present enough for us to detect it.
Let's talk about the chain of custody. Walk us through that process when a child's drug test like this is processed. How do you protect the integrity of the sample?
Right. So usually in these situations, there's, companies or government agencies that are contracted to collect the samples, whichever, type they have. So people are trained to collect hair or collect, urine or blood samples. Those should be sealed as soon as they're collected. They should be identified as belonging to that child. Noted the date and time of collection. Again, this should all be sealed and protected immediately so that when the laboratory receives it, they can see that they've received a sealed, untampered with item of evidence so that when they do the testing, they know that it is directly related to the person from whom the sample was taken.
If DHS is involved, how closely do forensic chemists work with them in cases like this?
Typically the chemist, we're not really talking to the collectors or in the investigators. They actually, the goal is to kind of keep people a little bit separated from, from the facts so that they're not, biased in some way with the results. They can just say, I've received a sample, just like I did all my other samples. It was properly sealed. I followed this specific testing process. So, in my career, a lot of times, I would get blood samples to test, and other than a name identified, I really didn't have any information about what case it was associated with. And sometimes it wasn't until I got to court, that I would find out the actual facts of the case. And that is, it's useful because the scientists should just be testing in a routine manner, and just getting the results as they are, so that there's no, chance of influence or bias or anything like that during the testing process.
Absolutely. And again, we've heard the 15-year-old, the 10-year-old, and the 6-year-old were all exposed to this. So, and the infant, but that was through breast milk. So, what would be just the differences? Like, what does the science tell us about the neurological risks with, comparing the 6-year-old, the 10-year-old, and the 15-year-old? How would each of them, what would the reaction to the drugs be in, like, to each of their small bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall you're going to see similar types of impairment, probably similar behaviors, but then people are different. So while some people it could produce anxiety, it could produce paranoia, it could produce calm in somebody. So it's not necessarily the size of the person, but it's kind of how they're, when they took it in, what was their state of mind when they took it in, and then how did their individual endocannabinoid system respond to the drug, and then just with any use of THC, one exposure can create outcomes that another may not. So if someone's in a really great mood going into it, it may be that the drug enhances that mood. Maybe if they're upset, it causes them to be more upset, paranoid, anxious. But again, we do know that it can cause that paranoia, anxiety, and it can also cause the body, as it's the brain, excuse me, as it's developing, to start creating these, pathways of, this is how it's going to respond to situations. How are they going to respond to anxiety? What is their impulse control going to be like? And it impairs the ability for them to develop that properly. And so you may see behaviors, out of, impulsive behaviors, or strong emotions during the use of it, but also in the long term from the effects of it.
And you spoke about anxiety and paranoia. What about psychosis or seizures or any other long term damage if kids are exposed to marijuana early?
I mean, the long-term exposure or early exposure again can impair the development of the brain the way that it needs to. So any of those things could happen, and it could be that there aren't any, extreme, exposure, cases that we're aware of. But I think the thing that we do know is that when the brain's developing up to age 25, we want to reduce and limit exposure to, any types of drugs. I mean, doctors, even prescription drugs, right? You may have to take it for a period of time, but they really like to limit what children are allowed to have, and monitor it. And so again, any exposure should really be overseen, by a doctor, and they're not going to recommend that you give a child alcohol, for example, or THC necessarily, unless there's some very specific disorders that they're treating.
Right, absolutely. And we know all drugs are bad, especially when it comes to kids. But are edibles even more dangerous than smoking because of just how long it stays in the system?
I mean, I think the big danger with edibles is that they seem appealing and they might taste good, right? So they're going to be easier. A child's going to be less likely to vape or smoke something than they probably would to eat something that looks like gummies or candy or chocolate. But in terms of how long it stays in the system, with edibles versus smoking, it really just takes longer for the effects to kick in with an edible. But in terms of the amount of time the drug actually stays in the system, whether exposed by smoke or by edibles, the length of time after the fact is going to be long for either.
What do you think the public gets wrong when they hear about marijuana exposure in kids?
I think that there's, because we know there are some medical advances and medical benefits to cannabis. I mean, we've heard some, you hear really great stories about how cannabis has aided people in difficult medical situations, people with mental health issues. Some people it actually helps them with anxiety. I think the biggest, problem is that people don't really understand that the dose is kind of what makes the toxin, right? So, you know, again, with kids, it's not really recommended unless there's some type of medical professional overseeing. But again, a little bit is, going to have certain effects and have certain benefits. But when you get high doses, like you're going to see, especially from vaping, these really high 80, 90% THC pens, that's not a dose that's meant for any type of medical benefit at that point. I mean, this is, this could be highly dangerous. And I think the thing people get wrong, and it's not their fault, but I think there's just a lot of misconceptions that anything you buy in the store is safe. Anything that you can get over the counter is safe. But there's a lot of many states that really don't have any regulation on any type of cannabis products. So the stuff you're buying, over the counter, it could be safe, but it also could be dangerous. These things are not always tested. Many states don't require, these vape pens and these edibles to be tested, by any third party outside of the manufacturer, and sometimes not even that. So I think the biggest risk is that we think that anything we buy in the store is safe, and that's not necessarily true. These things are not regulated the way other over-the-counter products and medications are. And so that is, something to just really be aware of as the general public.
Right. And in this case, I mean, the family was lucky. All of her children are alive and no one died, but that's not what happens in every instance. So, what's your message to any parent who thinks that letting their child try marijuana just once might not be that harmful?
I mean, you're taking a big risk anytime you introduce a substance, right? A new substance. I mean, I think that, is better. My thing is with any drug, any compound, even something prescribed by the doctor, make sure you understand what you're giving them. Make sure you understand what the dose is. Make sure that it's safe. Do research. And really, at this point, there's no recommendations to give your child, an impairing substance. And so, I think the best thing to do is avoid it in general, because there's nothing that's, showing without some type of, really clear medical oversight that there's safety in that. And you can't, why take that risk that one time that it's a bad product that has something in it that could harm your child even worse.
Absolutely. Some great advice there. Bethany, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
In addition to having no contact with her children, Deanna Woods will also have to take parenting and substance abuse classes. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.